It's your World War III update, my friends. It's with great pleasure that I can state with the utmost confidence today that we are further away from nuclear Armageddon today than we were yesterday. The doomsday clock, it ticketh backwards for the first time, and it's all owed to the efforts of one man, Donald J. Trump, who is charting a new pathway towards peace and prosperity for all the world's inhabitants. So let's just give him a big round of applause. Everything's going to be just fine. Wages are going to go sky high. The market, don't worry about it crashing. It's not going to crash. If anything, we're going to keep it sideways in the very least, at least for as long as we possibly can. We can revert back into that somnambulistic state of uncriticality and mindless consumption, and all will be well. And on that note, I want to say it's been great doing this channel for the last 10 years, and I'm now retiring because everything's fine now. There's nothing for me to talk about, right? So I guess for the last time, I will say thanks for watching. I won't say subscribe because this is it. This is the end. But keep on prepping if you want to. But there really isn't no need to anymore because everything's going to be A-okay. Thanks, guys. See you later. Okay, did all the oversensitive snowflakes go to bed? Okay, they all went to bed. Good. Time to go black pill doomer on your ass. Unfortunately, the aforementioned was a big steaming hot pile of bullshit. Now, let's get down to the nitty-gritty. For those of you who like to think you've come to the right place, because unfortunately, things are not as they seem. Now, let me quickly run down the news stories today, and then I'm going to start making inferences. U.S. Air Force patrols near Russia with B-52 nuclear bombers and an RC-135C rivet joint plane along the Finnish-Russian border. But wait a minute, I thought everything was going well. The Danes are warning about Russia preparing for a major war on the European continent, and the EU is getting ready to start seizing Russian ships in the Baltic Sea. Trump is announcing that the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia are going to be meeting for a high-level meeting in Munich in the next day or so. So we're going to be able to find out exactly what is going to transpire here. We're going to talk about this $500 billion deal that is supposedly about to be struck with Ukraine. I'm going to tell you what that's all about. Everything at this point in time is skullduggery and deception, and everything is not as it seems, okay? There's two diplomatic styles being employed here. There's the Biden style and the Trump style. Both are for the purpose of a deception and dealing with our adversaries just in a different way, all right? The Canadian premiers have visited the United States, and just one day later, Trump decided to do some sweeping retaliatory tariffs, as he called them, and claimed that if Canada does not become the 51st state, then we're going to not protect you with nuclear weapons. So I guess they're okay with the Chinese invading Canada and the Russians laying anchor on the Canadian shores, and they'll just be cool with that if we switch sides, I guess. Liberals are getting ready to invoke emergency powers to deal with Trump. Couldn't have seen that coming. No, not at all. A U.S. military jet entered Russian airspace for the first time since 2022, presumably in order to pick up some prisoner. They didn't stay too long. We have the pathway on flight radar to show you. Scholz, the German chancellor, has called for a state of emergency over the government's policy on Ukraine, or at least the perceived policy on Ukraine on behalf of the Americans. Israel is getting ready to strike Iran, possibly within months, according to the CIA-sponsored Washington Post. The EU is going to back Zelensky if he resists the Trump-Putin peace deal. So are we going to see a wedge driven between Nato? The Defense Minister, Pete Hegseth, is trying to compel the Europeans to up their military spend to 5% of their GDP, which will amount in total to trillions of dollars spent on U.S. weapons and armaments, and that they will only provide a nuclear umbrella and not provide any conventional support in such case that Russia decides to invade Europe, okay? We also have to talk about inflation, which is continuing to rise, and gold hits another new all-time high as we speak. So let's try to parse apart all the skullduggery and deception that is currently underway. There are two ways that you can negotiate, okay? You can be very confrontational with your adversaries, and you can be very threatening. You can issue ultimatums, or you can do the opposite. You can exhibit a more ingratiating style of negotiations where you basically roll out the red carpet, you engage in all kinds of pageantry and showmanship to try to cajole them into submission, essentially, stroking their egos, okay? So this is the approach of Donald Trump with our adversaries. The approach of Biden was to issue red lines and ultimatums and be very aggressive. But understand, both of these are just negotiating styles. It doesn't mean that Putin and Trump are best buddies. In fact, Putin is going to play along with this whole thing. And because the way that Trump is exhibiting this ingratiating behavior, it's so overt and so obvious to these other leaders. Obviously, they're going to interpret it as, okay, this guy is trying to butter us up because he wants to get something. Understand that the Russians will never trust, it doesn't matter who is in the seat of power, the Russians will never trust the Americans again. Not because they have any particular issue with Trump per se, but they know how capricious the American empire is, and as soon as this guy's not there anymore, things can change. It's not like an authoritarian society where a person can rule for many terms like Vladimir Putin, where you're dealing with the same power structure each and every time per se. I mean, you are, but Putin and the Russians and the Kremlin don't view Trump as the one as being the driving force behind all of this. They're looking at, and they've stated this explicitly on numerous occasions, that essentially the president more or less is a puppet, okay? And by and large, the owners of the corporation, who nobody really speaks to directly, are the ones who are pulling a lot of the strings. We'll not get into who exactly that is. No, it's not like shadowy, clandestine figures. It's just this loosely connected cabal of people with similar interests, and you can call it the deep state, perhaps. It is enduring interests that extend beyond the 4-year term of a president, put it that way. So Putin has a vested interest in going along with these negotiations, knowing full well that the Russians and the Americans are closer to the brink of nuclear war than they've ever been, regardless of who's in the driver's seat, okay? Which is why they are flying patrols with B-52 bombers there today off the border of Russia, okay? So the Russians, however, need a break, and the Moscow Stock Exchange is booming on the news that Trump wants to negotiate. The population in Russia, who's been so beleaguered by, just 3 years of austerity and sanctions, is finally starting to see a glimmer of hope on the horizon. And I don't think Putin wants to mess with that right now, at least for the time being, knowing full well that it's very likely that whatever is projected on the surface is not going to actually be what's happening behind the scenes. For one fundamental reason. It's because one thing that Trump said that everybody seems to be minimizing.
So we're getting security on our money. We're going to have it secured by, they have rare earth, and they have oil and gas, and they have a lot of other things, and we're asking for security on our money. They've agreed to it. Ukraine has agreed to it.
You are not sending any more aid to Ukraine.
No, we are, but we want it secured, and the money is going to be secured.
When will the U.S. stop sending funding? When will the U.S. stop sending?
Because if we didn't do that, then Putin would say he won. We're the thing that's holding it back, and frankly, we'll go as long as we have to go, because we're not going to let the other happen.
Okay, so you see what he just said there. There's all kinds of paradoxical, contradictory statements being issued here. And this really is the policy of the White House, regardless of who's in power. I mean, this is just how you play something like this. You try to be as strategically ambiguous as possible with your language, keep them guessing up until the last minute in the hopes that, you know, I guess you can kind of string them along. And maybe this really is the only pathway towards peace right now. So I'm not knocking the strategy entirely, but understand what he just said. He said that they're going to continue to arm Ukraine. The only difference is going to be because the sticking point for a lot of people, particularly in the MAGA crowd, and not all, okay, maybe it's only a smaller percentage, but a large percentage, I'm guessing, the fundamental thing they take issue with is not supporting the Ukrainian cause, but giving them a lot of money and the lack of accountability and the possibility for corruption and misuse of those funds. There's a lot of people within MAGA who do not like the Russians. In fact, that historically has been, you know, if you look at like throughout the McCarthyist era, that has been the Russophobic camp primarily. Now, again, I'm not trying to paint broad strokes and generalize for everybody here, but generally speaking, I just generalized, but typically speaking, I should say, most people will support the Ukrainian cause if it means that they don't have to foot the bill. So in knowing this, what they're now going to say is that, well, we're going to get all of these rare earth minerals from Ukraine in return, and we're going to do a lend-lease deal, which is basically Ukraine is going to pay us for the stuff in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to get a return on this investment, and we're going to be able to go and strip mine Ukraine for all these rare earth minerals with God knows what industrial infrastructure, because I mean the US is struggling to build infrastructure within its own country. Of course, we're in a global supply chain and it requires stuff. It requires real steel and expertise on the ground in a area that is not being constantly bombarded and that you can ensure in order to embark upon these projects. So understand that the likelihood that they're actually going to get anything in return for this is slim to none, in my personal opinion. The actual process of the strip mining of these rare earth minerals, based on what I've been told, is very difficult and it's very time consuming, and you certainly are not going to be able to do it in a wartime environment. Even if there is some detente and hostilities, you're still likely not going to get insurance companies that are going to be supporting such an enterprise. And even if you could, ultimately, it could not even be that profitable when you have to factor in all the logistics of all of it. So really, this is just the setup to say, okay, we're going to back Ukraine, but contrary to Joe Biden, we're not just giving money away. Okay, we're going to lend Ukraine money. Now understand, the idea of lending Ukraine money is not new. In fact, this is the Lindsey Graham plan. This is what he talked about for the longest time. When he talked about how they're going to try to, I say extort, you can say exploit, but it's really extortion, Ukraine's mineral wealth, which is estimated to be in the trillions, 70% of which, however, is in Russian-held territory. Okay, so that's part of the problem. But so they're going to try to do this, or at least that's what they're going to say they're going to do. They're going to continue to fund Ukraine because Trump knows the truth that they have to continue funding Ukraine. They're not going to back out of NATO. That's complete and utter nonsense. It's just not going to happen. Okay, there's a reason why the U.S. is flying a nuclear bomber around today while a rivet joint plane skirts the Finnish-Russian border. It's because they're not saying the quiet part out loud, but this whole illusion of dissolution of NATO and this division inside NATO, I think, is all illusory. You still have Russia or American nuclear weapons all scattered throughout Europe. You have a lot of American military capability, but what they want essentially is for the rearmament of Europe on Europe's dime, which is understandable. And of course, the profiteers of that are going to be the United States. And so if you're the Russians and you're hearing this, think about what you're hearing. You're hearing Pete Hegseth say, we want every country in NATO to up their military spend to 5%. Now, is that something that the Russians are going to want? You know, because Pete Hegseth explicitly stated that you need to prepare for the next threats, implying that it's going to be the Russian threat and that we, the United States, are preoccupied in the Pacific, working on the China threat, okay? Now, if I'm the Russians and I hear that the Americans are trying to basically force the Europeans into upping their spend on their military, is that good for me as the Russians? It probably isn't. So it's a very underhanded negotiation tactic, and I gotta hand it to him, it's very clever. It's far more clever than the more boorish, you know, head-first approach of Joe Biden and friends. It makes for more interesting, unsolved mysteries for us to try to, you know, figure out with respect to how all of this diplomacy is going. But most of the diplomacy is purely performative, what you're seeing right now. And both sides are going to play it up because, at least for the current time, both Trump's constituents and Vladimir Putin's supporters stand to benefit from being placated by this prospect of peace. So they're both going to play it up until they can't anymore. And they could string this out for quite a while, okay? One thing to consider is that the proposed peace plan with Ukraine involves European troops basically acting as an independent peace corps, independent from NATO, and working the border. Preventing, I guess, the Russians from reaching some sort of ceasefire. Now, the problem with this is, of course, this would essentially make them a de facto NATO state, which Trump is claiming that Ukraine's never going to be a NATO state. They're already a NATO state. I mean, really, they're fundamentally already a NATO state, with the exception of Article 5, which is still being implemented in many ways, just in a nuclear sense. That's the only way it's not being implemented. They're giving Ukraine all kinds of weapons. They're basically a protectorate, having their governments propped up with resources from the outside. So they're like a couple who's living common law. You know, they're essentially, in the eyes of the government, they're married. Now, when they get that legal piece of paper, that marriage certificate, does that really fundamentally change the relationship at all? Not necessarily, except if one of them, you know, breaks, then, you know, maybe they get half your stuff. Here in Canada, they get half your stuff anyways. But so it really doesn't matter, the whole NATO designation. But the interesting thing here is what Trump is proposing is that we're going to strip mine all of the materials, and Europe is going to stand guard and basically police this whole thing. Of course, the weapons that Europe is going to use are primarily going to come from U.S. companies. So this is great for the military-industrial complex in the United States. Now, that's if all of this plays out according to plan, which I highly doubt it will, because the Russians likely are not going to go for something like this that involves troops, NATO troops, inside Ukraine. But it all depends on what they consider to be Ukraine. Are they going to be content with the Dnieper River as a barrier? Are they going to be content having their annexed territories, understanding full well that they're never likely going to be able to bring the entirety of Ukraine to heel, and that all of those intermarium countries from the Baltics down to Poland and Romania are never going to be pro-Russian, at least not in a way that you can set your watch to. So they could be perfectly content with that. I mean, things could go any way, but here are the Russian preconditions as it stands. Denazification and demilitarization. Denazification is one of those things. Maybe the Russians have a clear set of criteria as in terms of what would constitute denazification, but we don't really know what that is. It's rather ambiguous in its interpretation. Demilitarization, which is pretty clear, which is why having 200,000, which is the proposed number of Euro Peace Corps, which are independent of NATO, so not to invoke Article 5, would likely be in violation of that. And of course, if you have 200 Peace Corps soldiers soldiers, right? They probably wouldn't be referred to as such, peacekeepers, on the border, then what is it exactly they are protecting on the other side? Are the Russians going to want some sort of audits into Ukraine? Of course, Ukrainians are never going to go for this at all, okay? I mean, Zelensky is already being very hesitant about it, although he is very receptive to the idea of giving up their economic sovereignty, because Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, went there yesterday, surprisingly. We have a video of that to show you. And he basically, it appears as though that it was a very copacetic arrangement, if you can say, and that they, even though they haven't agreed and inked anything yet, it appears as though they're going to ink a deal that is going to basically allow Ukraine to spread their legs to the U.S. industrial complexes of all sorts, and is going to allow them to have their wealth, whatever remains of it, basically exported to the United States. So it appears as though that is definitely going to be underway. Now, Ukraine must give up all the territories that Russia has annexed. Ukraine must be neutral, non-aligned, and a non-nuclear state. Yesterday, the press secretary for Trump declined to say whether or not Ukraine would be allowed to have nuclear weapons. Of course, there's a lot of talk of that right now. And before I continue in this list, because I'm like a squirrel, I got so much going on in my brain, I have to say that the likelihood for sabotage at this point in time, if there was a legitimate peace talk, understand there are so many parties here with strategic agency within NATO, with their own independent set of interests, that anything can happen. There's so many ways that these talks could be sabotaged with some sort of provocation in the Baltic, some false flag operation, somebody trying to force the invocation of Article 5. A lot of things could happen right now at this period of time. We could see an assassination or something to just throw everything into a tailspin and try to up the Russophobic hate. Because when you have populist uprisings in your country, whether it's in Canada, which they've been able to, for the most part, keep at bay, with the exception of the truckers' protests, which of course they use emergency powers in order to deal with, and they're going to try to do that again. The best thing that you can have as a dictator is an outside enemy. Okay, you need an enemy who is outside the gates threatening people, and that is going to allow you to take that populist energy, a lot of which is nationalistic in its nature, and channel that populist nationalist fervor into some exterior enemy of sorts, okay? And so that is what they're going to try to do here, I believe. That is how they're going to try to get the reins on their own population, is they need an outside enemy, somebody. And unfortunately, the Russians have not bit yet. So if the Russians are not responding in kind to these various provocations of European countries who greatly dislike the Russians, then they're going to have to cook up some false flag of their own, very likely, in order to stoke the flames of that Russophobic hate once again. Especially now that it appears as though the bridge is being, the divide is being bridged. But again, don't mistake Trump going and shaking Putin's hand for being anything other than a negotiating tactic. These guys are not friends. It was the Trump administration who initially started sending weapons to Ukraine. Okay, it was the Trump administration who backed out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. There were all kinds of things that precipitated this on Trump's watch. And I'm not saying that Trump is to blame per se. This is a continuation of policies that go back to Obama and beyond, most likely. But just understand that this is just a negotiating style, and it's actually even more dangerous because you're dealing with a style that would stab you in the back instead of stab you in the front, essentially. And some people would say, well, Trump's more forthcoming and he's honest in what he's saying. And while there's some truth to that, don't think that he's not playing some 4D chess here as well. And he's a businessman. He's trying to sell Putin a car, right? And what do you do when you're trying to sell somebody a car? You don't be all aggressive and belligerent. You try to basically adorn them with compliments and roll out the red carpet, and again, just try to be really nice. And sometimes it's too overt and exaggerated, and the other side doesn't buy it. And I'm afraid that that's what's probably going to happen. The Russians don't want the Ukrainians to have any more than 50,000 troops, okay? 500 artillery pieces, which is a strange number, and no more than 342 tanks. There's also the risk here, and part of the reason why the Ukrainians cannot turn their back on, or part of the reason why the Americans cannot turn their back on the Ukrainians, is because, as I've always stated, one of the greatest fears of NATO is that Ukraine joins the Russians. And I know that sounds crazy, but understand there's a lot of support in Ukraine for Russia still, presumably because many of them voted for pro-Russian candidates in the past. I'm not sure if the sentiment has changed there, but they understand each other's language. There's a very similar cultural relationships there, and many of them have ties that go back to the Soviet times. So essentially, this is a civil war, and which is why Russia has arguably not went as hard as a mofo as many of the more hardline hawks in Russia would like. Vladimir Putin understands this to be a civil war. And one of the things that the West fears now is that Ukraine, with the most experience in fighting, experience points earned from the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost, and the Russians as well. The Ukrainians and the Russians fighting with one another, they're actually making themselves a lot stronger in terms of their frontline experience with combat. Now, sure, a lot of that experience is being relayed to NATO, just like the drone data that is probing Russia's airspace looking for weak points in case NATO just sporadically decides to do a decapitation strike on the Kremlin all of a sudden. I mean, I wouldn't even be surprised at this point if Vladimir Putin is in a very high state of alert, higher state of alert with all of this friendliness, right? Because he could be just interpreting this as pure deception, buttering him up to lower his defenses so that they can do a decapitation strike. There is a possibility of that, although I think it's probably slim at this point. I think Trump is trying to buy time, but understand that the tension remains the same. A complete ban on any import of weaponry into Ukraine, and every guarantor state involved, the US, UK, France, China, Russia, required to pull out of all treaties and international agreements that allowed arms sales to Ukraine, unless those sales went to Crimea. So it is incredibly likely that they're not going to be able to negotiate a deal, at least not in the short term. Now, anything can happen. Anything can happen, okay? But fundamentally, the United States and Russia are at odds, financially most of all, and geopolitically, militarily. And don't think for a second that all of these political niceties are anything but another strategy to buy more time. Now, people will get overly sensitive and say, Nate, you're too hard on Trump. And I say, look, no politician is beyond reproach. Every politician has their motives for being where they are, and nobody is perfect. Nobody is a virtuoso. Nobody is 100%, with the best intentions of everybody in mind, is 100% utilitarian. With Trump, I'm willing to concede that I do believe that, a guy like that who doesn't need to be in that position, you can maybe make the claim that he's in it for egotistical purposes. You could just make the claim that he loves his country. It's possible. I'm not, the jury's still out on it. I think Trump as an individual is probably not somebody who's carrying a lot of nefarious intent, at least nothing that is nefarious in a way that seeks to, really destroy and undermine humanity and bring death and destruction on everybody. Do I disagree with a lot of his policies? Sure. Do I think the people around him are actually motivated by those things? Absolutely. And do I think that they're going to be able to manipulate him into moving things in that direction? Unfortunately, yes, I do. Like I say, I'm a black pill. I've been duped way too many times, okay? And Trump's duplicity on a variety of different issues, I just don't trust politicians, period, point blank. And if you have a problem with that, then, that's your problem, right? So we're going to agree to disagree. Now, what should we talk about next? All my links are basically frying here. Okay, everything is going away. All right, well, all my links have basically expired because I've talked too damn long. This is a flight path of a RAF plane in the Black Sea, I believe. So we have more activity, once again, in the Black Sea near the Kerch Bridge, close to Russia, something we haven't seen for some time. This is a map of the proposed plans that both sides have so far resisted. Zelensky appears to not be on board with this plan, and I guess we're going to have to see in the next day or so whether at the Munich conference, whether or not things are going to be decided. Now, it appears as though Putin, Trump, and Zelensky are getting ready to meet in Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure if it's going to be Putin, Trump, and Zelensky, or it's probably going to be representatives of all those countries first. This is a flight path of the B-52 Stratofortress, which of course is nuclear capable, that was traversing the Swedish North Sea region. At the same time, we have the Boeing RC-135V rivet joint plane doing its thing, which of course is a surveillance plane. It appears as though this plane is monitoring the northern part of Russia, where of course there's a lot of strategic activity, and of course Russia has a very strong presence in the Arctic as well. So again, we can't just presume that it's almost a very dangerous time, because people are going to be incredibly on edge, especially if you're Vladimir Putin, thinking that maybe they're just trying to be nice to me, so I put my defenses down, right? This is the regional value of Ukraine's mineral resources, as you can see, most of which is in Russian territory. So I do think that this is all a ruse, this talk that we are going to get in return for supplying Ukraine with weapons. We're going to get something in return. And I think that's just to basically appease Trump's voters. The Bundestag should make the decision as soon as possible, according to Olaf Scholz, according to which the war in Ukraine and its serious consequences for the security of Germany and Europe should be classified as an emergency in the sense of Article 115. This leads to the fact that our support for Ukraine, which is more important today than ever, is no longer at the expense of the other tasks that our state has to fulfill towards its citizens. So essentially, they're issuing a state of emergency to try to figure out how they can now make up for the fact that the U.S. could potentially pull support from Ukraine, which they aren't, right? Because Trump said that they aren't going to do that. I really don't know what to make of a lot of this, to be brutally honest. We just have to see how it unfolds. Scholz has been reluctant to provide Ukraine with longer-range weapon systems. Perhaps he was pressured to do so by the United States, but refrained from doing so, and maybe now he has to make that call. Of course, not wanting to put himself in the crosshairs of the Russians, because we all know what happens when the Russians fight the Germans. it usually doesn't end too well for the Germans. Mind you, Russia had Lend-Lease behind them in World War II. So I guess the jury's still out in terms of, what really won World War II. Obviously, the Russians did most of the heavy lifting, but could they have done it without the support of the United States? It's hard to say. Anyways, now Trump is bloviating about not wanting to build nuclear weapons anymore, which is just, it's just silly at this point in time. Backing out of nuclear treaties. You're talking about China, who already has less nuclear weapons than you. So basically what you're trying to do with this style of negotiation is prevent China from advancing, which we know China isn't going to not want to do that, especially when Pete Hegseth just said that China is our main enemy. Okay, so it's very duplicitous, and a lot of this is just for public consumption. At this point in time, all of these public statements, understand that they're 90% for public consumption. They are not what Vladimir Putin is getting his information from. That's happening on the back channels. And both Trump and Putin are aware that what they tell their own populations is just a way to manage their own populations. It's not like a way that they're trying to communicate with one another. Mark Rutte, the chief of NATO, has basically stated that they need to prepare for war with Russia. Russia could attack NATO within 2 years, according to the Danish Ministry of Defense annual report. I'm not sure why Russia would do that, but that's the claim. Of course, setting it up for a possible false flag provocation. I'm not saying that Russia has no interest in attacking Europe. Maybe they do. Maybe they're waiting till they're weak. Who knows? Maybe the threat is real and not imagined. Russia may be targeting neighboring countries like non-NATO within 6 months after the war in Ukraine ends. I presume they're primarily referring to the Baltic states. Russia is shifting from military reconstruction to intensified rearmament. Now, he has stated that the Russians are outproducing the entirety of the West by a factor of 3, okay? They are producing more weapons than all of NATO combined by a factor of 3. And that's just the Russians, okay? That doesn't include the Chinese. So indeed, the Russians, when you pair that with their experience fighting a modern peer-to-peer combat, will be a force to be reckoned with moving forward in the future. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine prevents Russia from fully rebuilding its forces. However, post-Ukraine, Russia will have the resources to increase its military capacity significantly. So if this is all true, and if Russia is going to be permitted to get these annexed territories, and if sanctions are lifted, can you imagine the economic boom that is going to ensue inside Russia when you have a population that just wants to live and doesn't want to live under the gun and just wants to live and work hard and advance their society technologically that's been under the boot heel of this looming threat of conflict for the longest time, and you unleash that. Russia will be a force to be reckoned with. And I'm pretty sure that NATO realizes that, and now, especially adding that territory, not only have they added population, they've added geographic territory, they've added a buffer zone, they've also added resources to that, and they've expanded their sphere of influence. So Russia is essentially now Russia, Belarus, and part of Ukraine. So many fear that this is the beginning of the reemergence of the Soviet Empire. And as such, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. So that means that Europe on the whole is indeed less powerful. And if they abandon the Ukrainians, they know full well that the Ukrainians will likely join the Russians, and then those guns are going to be pointing west. And they don't want that to happen. So they're getting ready for a massive military buildup. You are going to see a rearmament campaign in Europe, the likes of which we've never seen before. Hegseth said, the link that I couldn't open, that if you guys don't do this 5% thing, where you're spending 5% of your GDP, we're not going to support you conventionally. He didn't say that they're not going to continue maintaining that nuclear umbrella over Europe, which arguably is the only thing that the Russians really fear when it comes to the Americans, with the exception of maybe some intermediate weaponry. But it's nukes, right? Because what's that old saying? An elephant can't fight a whale, right? And the United States is a whale, and the Russians are land-based military and an elephant. So, you know, the Americans can only mobilize so much, especially now that their military has been in disarray for as many years, and they're trying to rebuild it with this new super cop Rambo Hegseth guy, right? Apparently, it's working a little bit because enrollment numbers are up, but good luck convincing a Zoomer population who can get all their kicks on Call of Duty at home in the comfort of their living room and not have to endure that kind of real gritty bloodshed that is visceral, and it sucks, and you realize right away that no, you can't just run around for hours and hours without tiring and without getting sweaty and devoured by bugs and in weather and constantly, you know, on edge, looking over your back, watching your buddies getting blown to pieces all around you. Nobody in this generation in Western society is going to sign up for that when they realize what it is. I remember that video. It was right when the Ukraine war started, and all those mercenaries got taken out by the Russian, what was not a Iskander, it was like a Kinzhal. I think it was one of the first time they used the hypersonic missile, and the guy was saying how terrified they all were and how they just wanted to get out of the country after that, and that they wouldn't let them leave, in fact, and that they weren't even giving them appropriate weapons. They were just sending them to the front to die and all this stuff. So, you know, it's going to be a hard sell, a very hard sell if it ever came to that. But what essentially they're saying is that you guys need to spend a lot more on weapons. And so we're going to sustain the nuclear umbrella. We're going to continue to extract Ukraine's resource wealth, or at least that's what we're going to tell our population to make it appear as though we're getting something in return. And you guys are going to get prepared to fight the Russians conventionally. Okay, and all of that data that we've extracted from the Ukrainians will ultimately use, maybe in the next administration, that'll be their job. It appears as though right now the focus might be shifted to Iran, because that is what the CIA-backed Washington Post is suggesting is going to be next. And I've, of course, suspected that for the longest time as well. So just expect a lot of unscrupulous shenanigans in the coming months and the coming weeks ahead. There's going to be a lot of deception at work. And we're going to see divides like this one here. This is Kaja Kallas. I can't remember which Baltic country she is representative of, but it's one that doesn't have a big army, okay? So let's see what she has to say.
Simply not work because you need serious agreements made behind our backs. It will simply not work because you need, for any kind of deal, any kind of agreement, you need Europeans to implement this deal. You need the Ukrainians to implement this deal.
So she's saying if there's a deal made behind the Baltics' back, that it's not going to work. And when she's saying that, I think what they're kind of hinting at is that we're going to sabotage that shit, okay? And now in the Baltic Lake, the Nato Lake as they're calling it, they're getting ready to seize Russian vessels and cargo ships, saying that the Russians are destroying undersea cables and they got to inspect these ships, and that there's a shadow fleet operating and they're trying to circumvent the sanctions. And so that's where something is going to start. That's where the next thing is going to pop off in the Baltic. Let me see if I have that. So yeah, Europe is preparing to seize Russian oil export tankers in the Baltic. According to Politico, European countries are holding behind-the-scenes talks on a large-scale seizures of Moscow's oil exporting tankers in that region. And this is part of the reason why Russia is not slowing in its military recruitment. They've recently passed a bill on the implementation, or they didn't pass it, it's been introduced to the Duma, and if it's been introduced and they're talking about it, it will be passed. That's typically how things work in Russia. A bill on the implementation of the decision on conscription for military service was introduced to the State Duma, and essentially it's difficult to interpret this translation, but essentially what they're saying is that if you have evaded conscription, or have been able to evade conscription, or maybe you have already been conscripted, we can either extend that period of conscription, or we can recruit you at a later time. So essentially expanding the dragnet for conscription in a way which is not too overt, so not to inspire any sort of recalcitrant rage from their population. But I think people in Russia are probably happy right now with the way things are playing out, because the MOEX is booming. Investment is coming back into the Moscow Stock Exchange, which won't be good for the US Stock Exchange. And this is part of the reason why the strategy of, what do they call it? There's a term for it, constant pressure for Russia, maximum pressure campaign for Russia. It's important that the U.S. doesn't take their foot off the gas with that from their perspective. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying that, in the grand scheme of things, because it hurts, it takes money away from the Western economies, essentially. And what's good for the goose is not good for the gander in this particular situation. This is Mark Carney, the leader, just to change, I don't know if we're getting ready to totally change lanes here, but Mark Carney, who is the incumbent for our liberal leader, as Justin Trudeau is basically, going to be gone soon. He is now saying that he is going to invoke emergency powers to fight America, and this is exactly what I was warning you guys about.
My government is going to do is to use all of the powers of the federal government, including the emergency powers of the federal government, to accelerate the major projects that we need in order to build this economy and take on the Americans.
They love this. I'm telling you, they love this. They want nothing more than a trade war, because it's the only way they're going to be able to stay in office. This is the best thing that Trump could have ever done for the Liberals. I know he didn't do it intentionally, but he basically did them a favor, okay? They're now stoking the Trump fear, some of which might be legitimate, some of which, is probably just derangement. But nonetheless, what dictators need is an outside enemy to quell populist uprisings. And that's exactly what they're going to do. And then they're going to pass more emergency powers, and they're going to give out some more nanny state handouts and keep everybody dependent on them. And that's how the story is going to go. And we're going to get all our frickin' guns taken away. And at the end of it all, we'll be no better. So I'm certainly not an advocate. Honestly, at this point in time, does it matter? You know what? I always carry in my EDC, some of you guys are going to laugh at this. I always carry American money and Canadian money, because you just never know. One day, when the shit hits the fan, maybe this has value. Maybe this has value. Like that movie Civil War. Remember? If you have Canadian money, then they accept it, but not American money. Things can go either way right now. I just don't know. I mean, things could revert to Civil War. That movie could play out. I mean, look, with all of the shit that's going down, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some more assassination attempts, okay? It very well could happen. So, and if that happens, man, things are just going to get out of control real fast. In terms of whether or not I agree with what Elon and Trump are doing, here's the thing, and here is the really unbiased, 30,000 foot view, guys. I think that the only way you can make any changes is if you fundamentally shake things up a lot. And the problem is, though, with what they're doing, and I don't agree with everything Elon's doing. I don't even agree that Elon should be the one doing what's being done. But it is what it is. The problem with that is that the pendulum is going to swing back the other way. And every time it's swung back, it's been more and more extreme. Now, when the pendulum swings back in the other direction, it's going to get ugly. It's going to get very, very ugly. All of the highs and the W's that the right is experiencing right now will be followed by the complete opposite. okay, for the other side. And that's what I worry about. I worry that once this party and this bromance and the brolarchy period is over, broligarchy is over, it's going to get nasty when the other side takes the reins once again. I tell you, that COVID authoritarianism stuff, it was scary. It was scary in a weird sort of dark way. Now that said, what's happening right now isn't exactly, it might be relieving for some people, but I'm very worried because I'm always worried about absolute power. Absolute power corrupts abso-frickin-lutely. And I'm more worried about Elon Musk at this period of time than I am about Donald Trump, to be brutally honest. I think that if there's anybody who is duplicitous and cannot be trusted, it's that guy. It's not Donald Trump, okay? Now, the Washington Post claims that Israel is getting ready for strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. I mean, we've been saying this for the longest time. It's very likely to happen. The pressure campaign on Iran is going to intensify. And I think now that Israel is under the wing of Trump, or vice versa, Trump will provide them everything that is necessary in order to complete such a mission, even if it means including some B-2 bombers in the mix, well and beyond, refueling planes. They're not going to do a ground campaign. They don't have the capabilities for that. But they're only going to do it when they can be sure that they have oil where they want it. Because if Iran starts shooting missiles in all directions and they close the Strait of Hormuz and they start getting the Houthis to light up Saudi Aramco once again and the Emirates, it could get ugly, and that could potentially tank global markets. Now, the United States is going to be well positioned come that time as a net exporter of oil in order to benefit from that, but so are the Russians, okay? So you don't want to do anything that's going to empower the Russians disproportionately. You want to continue to secretively support Ukraine's attacking Russian oil infrastructure. And this is why I believe that whatever we're seeing, even though the Russians, if you go on Russian media right now, they're showing Trump with like pictures of halos over his head and all this stuff. They're playing the game, okay? This is all a game. This is not a real bromance that's happening here, okay? It's as bromance as Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump were just a few months before Kim Jong-un decided to, triple or quadruple the amount of missile tests that they did and build more nuclear weapons. It's because it's all just a show. It's pantomime theater. It's for the masses. So don't believe it for a second. This is the picture of the premiers, and this was very unexpected when all of the Canadian premiers went to the White House, and nobody really heard about this until it actually happened. Now, I thought that this might be a way for them to go around Trudeau and the Liberals. Maybe it is. I don't know, but they did it, and apparently it didn't turn out too well because Trump is issuing the same old types of rhetoric that he wants Canada to become the 51st state. Look, man, if I can get some ARs and I can not have to worry about border issues, shipping stuff across the border, and I gotta tell you, it's tempting, guys. It is really tempting. You guys joke about it in the comments section, and a part of me is, I'm proud to be Canadian, blah, blah, blah. And I don't want to have to take on my portion of America's debt load, which is really what this is about. It's Trump looking for an easy win and a scapegoat. See, this is the Trump strategy, right? Your subordinates, you be aggressive towards your subordinates and your allies, and you try to lavish, your opponents with, compliments and whatnot, and try to befriend them, and through very Machiavellian machinations try to subdue your enemies with positivity, and basically try to keep your allies and your underlings under your boot heel, and make threats and ultimatums. It's just a completely flipped strategy that Biden had, and it's not necessarily better or worse. Both perhaps have a time and place to be used. So I'm not waffling on the issue. It's just a reality. This is how we do on this channel, guys. I'm a critical thinking person. I can't not think. I know it'd be easy if I just turned my brain off and just jumped on one side of the fence and that was it. Trust me, I'd make a lot more money. I'd have a lot more than 40 bucks on me. Well, actually, it's only 30 bucks because the Canadian buck isn't worth nearly as much as the American. In the Baltic states, they are happier than pigs in slop right now, because now they get to pay 150, whatever currency this is, euros, instead of 62 euros for a megawatt of energy. Congratulations. Again, people ask, why do the Baltic states do this to themselves? Well, it's not the Baltic states, it's leaders who want to retain power, who need an outside enemy. And so they're going to go along with this. They will shoot themselves economically in the foot, and they don't care because they're the elites in the society. They're not the ones who are going to suffer from this type of austerity that is brought with a war with Russia. So they've disconnected from the Russian power grid. They're paying over twice the amount of money for power now, and that's just how it is, right? If Ukraine is not in NATO, Ukraine will build NATO on its territory. Again, they're de facto. They're already common law, okay? It doesn't matter if they have the marriage certificate or not. Ukraine is NATO as is. The Americans did a elephant walk with their F-22 Raptors the other day, which was interesting. It was interesting flex, a rare flex. They do these elephant walks every once in a while. Of course, the U.S. doesn't have military parades like many countries do. Perhaps this is sending a message to somebody, sending a message to Putin. You're going to see a lot of this weird stuff happening where you're wondering, wait a minute, aren't we supposed to be having peace talks? Well, this is how they communicate with one another, okay? Because they know that all of the theater that is there for the masses is not the true posture, that they have to posture in this way in order to get their point across and send these signals to the other side. So make no mistake about it, we are nowhere near close to achieving peace, but we're at least going to get a nice photo op. I guarantee you, when Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump meet, it is going to be one of the most watched pieces of content probably in the history of the internet, okay? It will be. At least I think, unless this individual right here, what is her name again? She represents some kind of, let's just see, I can't remember what it was. It's this elaborate name. So this is how they're going to basically control the minds of the masses for the next 4 years, okay? And it's all going to be under the guise of relinquishing all kinds of government secrets to you, the wage slave, right? So these good guys are now just suddenly going to share all the secrets of the universe, whether it's JFK, Epstein files, UFOs, the list goes on and on. They're just going to tell you everything now. Now, why would they be doing this, guys? Why would they be doing this right now? It's not because they're good guys and they, it's because there's an ulterior motive to this. It's likely a shot across the bow to their opponents that, hey, we got dirt, and we're going to blackmail you with it. And if you don't play ball, if you don't do exactly what we want, then we're going to release some secrets, okay? The other aspect of this is that this is a treasure trove of red herrings, distractions, ways that they can get people, bones that they can throw at MAGA, while they do other things that involve making concessions on the big league issues, right? So they're going to have to make concessions on numerous things, and when they have to do that, they're going to release another JFK document that day. Oh, there's another Epstein list. Oh, look, see, we're sticking it to the man, right? Well, let's just hear what she has to say. By the way, this is I'm not sure if she's an Israeli dual citizen. Not surprisingly, she's good friends with Benjamin Netanyahu, and she's going to be the one who oversees. She's going to be the final say and the filter on which secrets get revealed and which ones get redacted. Let's see what she has to say.
With the stroke of a pen, he committed to declassifying the files concerning the assassinations of President John
Oh yeah, it's that easy. You know, with the stroke of a pen. Yeah.
F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. A decision not just monumental, but pivotal. It is with profound honor that I have been entrusted by Speaker Mike Johnson and...
Now, understand, they're never going to do anything that incriminates anybody they don't want to be incriminated. So either a lot of these people are going to already be dead, who are going to be culpable for any past wrongdoings that they're going to actually reveal information about, or it's going to be people they don't like. So, or it's just going to be a big nothing burger, and it's going to be this prime time unsolved mysteries, David Duchovny, Robert Stack type ordeal.
And Chairman James Comer to lead the House Oversight Task Force on Declassification of Federal Secrets.
House Oversight Task Force on the Declassification of Government Secrets. Wow.
Together with the help of the White House, our intelligence allies, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, we will be conducting investigations into the following: the assassinations of JFK, RFK.
Imagine they're sitting there at home and thinking, actually believing that they're doing this for your dumbass, right? And I'm talking about myself as well. Imagine believing that the elites of all elite are just going to start revealing secrets for the betterment of you, the individual. Free candy, folks!
And Dr. Martin Luther King, unidentified aerial phenomena, also known as UAPs, unidentified submerged objects, also known as USOs, the Epstein client list, the origins of COVID-19, and the 9/11 files.
Oh, yeah.
This task force will be a beacon of
9/11. That's going to be interesting.
On the Republican side, Representatives Burchett, Boebert, Burleson, Crane, Gill, and Mace will be joining me.
I wonder if they're going to talk about Larry Silverstein and World Trade Center 7. I highly doubt it. Oh, they might.
With Gill and Mace will be joining me, although I'd like to note that I'm expanding this to the entire governing body and will be allowing certain members to waive on. Our first hearing is set for March. The date will be announced soon, and we've already initiated close to a dozen communications with various agencies, to include Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice and the Secretary of State. This will no longer be a task force that makes bold promises only to fade into irrelevance or send strongly worded letters. This will be a relentless pursuit of truth and transparency, and we will not stop until the...
This will be a TV show, complete with our own branding and logo and music. Take a look at this.
On the declassification of federal secrets has been organized under the House Oversight Committee and represents a historic step towards transparency and delivering answers to the American people. President...
Why do they need the Unsolved Mysteries music? If this is really serious, why do they need that music in the background? I mean, think about it. This is a government agency, and they're presenting this like it's some kind of TikTok video, because it's for the purpose of brainwashing, and it's nothing is as it seems. Come on, guys, use your brains.
President Trump has already...
Oh, Nate, you're too much of a black pill doomer, man.
Taken steps to deliver to the American people information that for far too long has been kept under the federal government's lock and key through classification. Under Executive Order 14176, President Trump has directed the federal government to prepare reports regarding the declassification of records regarding the assassinations of President...
I think she used to be a stripper, and I'm not just saying that. I think I actually heard somewhere that she was a stripper at one point. You can kind of hear it in her voice.
John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, and the Reverend...
If I'm wrong about that, by the way, I apologize, but that's what I heard.
Dr. Martin Luther King. The task force will also examine agencies' knowledge and possession of documents regarding other areas of significant public interest, including UAPs, the origins of COVID-19, the Epstein client list, and details surrounding the death of Osama bin Laden in Operation Neptune Spear. Our first hearing is March and will focus on the assassination of President Kennedy.
See, they're going to play this out. They're going to draw it out anytime they screw up. Hey, let's release an Epstein file, or, let's throw Bill Gates under the bus. Oh, shit. All right, so this is what they are getting ready in, let me just see here. So they're getting ready to send these shipping container weapons to Ukraine. So it's about to get asymmetrical. In Iran, they have a lot of these. I can't show it because the video might be copyright struck, but essentially it's that right there. They hide in shipping containers. So I'm surprised Ukraine has not been fighting this war like this already. Putting weapon systems in nondescript vehicles that are like just trucks that the Russians don't necessarily want to waste a missile on. This is probably where the war is going to be progressing here in the not so distant future. And the Germans are apparently churning out 1,000 drones a month with Ukraine's name on them. The US and UK refused to sign Paris Summit Declaration on Inclusive AI. Confirmation of snub comes as JD Vance criticizes Europe's excessive regulation on the technology. So they basically want to allow free rein to AI companies to do what they want without any sort of government oversight, which, yeah, I kind of understand that to a degree. One could say that, well, maybe these concerns are exaggerated, maybe AI is not going to kill us, but I mean, a part of that is because they want, it's an arms race, and perhaps they believe that they'll be able to make more advances in that way. But this is definitely a dangerous place to be. And in fact, it was Elon Musk who was campaigning just a few years ago to bring more government regulations on AI. Now, I have mixed opinions about regulating AI because AI could, in fact, provide solutions that would ultimately undo the very unequal aspects of our society. And I'm not saying this from like a communistic point of view, but what it might do is create so much abundance that we no longer need to have people who are obscenely wealthy and people who are obscenely poor, okay? You could make an argument, and I'm all for the free market, you guys know that, but there comes a point when if a society is too imbalanced, and I credit this to Jordan Peterson for making this observation, who is a hardline, right-wing capitalist, even he appreciates the fact that if a society becomes too economically unbalanced, then the poor will revolt. It's just a matter of time. And all of the elites know this, and this is why they want to roll out universal basic income, to keep the peasants at bay, give us just enough to be happy in our pods, and by that time it'll be virtual reality, AI, creating custom video games for everybody in real time, and we'll forget about the fact that we don't have any grass or a yard to put it in. But, I have a sneaking suspicion that the AI arms race is going to derail the best plans that we have in the not-so-distant future. It really is the wild card that is at play here, and it's unfolding at such a rapid pace that it's pretty scary. Elon Musk, as I've said for the longest time, he needs to be careful because, and I understand he's got probably a very tight security detail, but he is really putting himself out there. And it almost seems like he is, I'm not sure if he's doing it intentionally. Maybe he wants that kind of negative publicity, but eventually something is going to happen. Okay, I predict that there's going to be shots taken, and I don't want that to happen, of course, but it's going to happen. And, the pendulum is just going to keep swinging wildly, and civil war eventually is the end result of all of this. The U.S. State Department has a budget line for armored Teslas worth $400 million. Now, if you recall, I've long since speculated that full self-driving FSD, one of its primary functions in the future and what it's actually being made for, is the military. In order to train Tesla FSD, you need millions and probably billions of miles of data to feed into that mother brain algorithm AI that is the Tesla vision that amalgamates the images from the cameras and determines what's what, and then you plop that onto a tank or onto a vehicle, and suddenly Everybody's riding shotgun, and it looks as though my battery is going to die, guys, so I don't think I'm going to be able to make it through the rest of this video. Inflation's up. The market is highly overvalued. NASDAQ EP estimates are through the roof. Options volumes are at record highs. Household allocation to equities is the highest it's ever been, so the stock market crash is going to be bigger than ever before. The price of eggs is higher than ever before. We got record temperatures. The sea ice is melting. Gold is still at record all-time highs, baby. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe.